The US has announced it seized two oil tankers, the Safia in international waters near the Caribbean and the Marinera, formerly known as the Bella 1 in the North Atlantic.
The U.S. Coast Guard releasing video of one of its ships shadowing the tanker during the operation.
The UK said it supported the mission to seize it between Iceland and the British Isles.
What if one of the most explosive moments in recent US-Russia relations didn't happen on the ground in Ukraine or in diplomatic backrooms in Geneva, but far out at sea, thousands of miles from any capital? On January 7th, in the chilly waters between Iceland and the United Kingdom, that scenario went from hypothetical to reality when the United States carried out a dramatic and controversial seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker long pursued by US authorities after it tried to evade a blockade. The United States had been tracking the vessel for weeks after it slipped through a US naval blockade near Venezuela.
The United States has seized a Venezuelan-linked Russian-flagged oil tanker in the North Atlantic, about 200 kilometers off the Icelandic coast.
Refused boarding by the Coast Guard and attempted to disappear into the vast Atlantic. With its repainted hull and freshly declared Russian registry, the ship seemed to be playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. After several weeks of chasing the tanker, applying diplomatic pressure, and careful planning, helicopters, Coast Guard ships and naval forces finally surrounded the vessel near Iceland, far from the tropical waters where it had first tried to escape. So how did the United States manage to outmaneuver a vessel under supposed Russian protection? Keep watching as we uncover how the US seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker and left a lasting mark on the high seas. On the grey morning of January 7th, 2026, men and machines met on the edge of the North Atlantic, and a fast-moving episode of modern sea power ended with a single, old tanker under new control. The ship carried the look of a vessel trying to disappear, a worn hull, a hastily repainted flag, a new name painted over an older identity, yet it moved in a way that exposed its authors. US forces, after tracking the vessel for more than 2 weeks, closed and boarded. The seizure was not a cinematic firefight. It was the endpoint of persistent tracking, legal paperwork, and layered military pressure that moved in from the sky and sea to deny a vessel the anonymity it sought. The United States said the tanker had been operating to move Venezuelan oil while dodging sanctions, and the ship's recent attempt to hide under another country's flag helped justify the action the US took that day. To understand why a single tanker could provoke diplomatic fireworks, you have to see the larger picture. For the past 2 years, a so-called shadow fleet, a dispersed network of tankers, many aged and opaque in ownership, has done heavy lifting for countries that face Western sanctions. As major traders and insurers tightened rules, owners and operators turned to legally fragile registries, frequent name changes, and tactics intended to confuse trackers, transponders turned off, sailing under false flags, paperwork that could not be verified. By late 2025, the trend had hardened into something that moved real volumes of crude beyond normal market channels. A number of intelligence and maritime analysts concluded that the fleet had reached into the hundreds or more. Maritime data firms that track vessel behaviour documented growing numbers of reflagging and dark runs toward Venezuelan ports. That pattern, sanctioned cargoes, false paperwork and persistent movement, is the context that made the simple-looking seizure of one ship in the Atlantic an event with outsized consequences. The tanker at the centre of the January operation had been known to authorities as Bella 1. It left a visible trace across public ship tracking data, an older hull, an International Maritime Organization entry, and a history of voyages that ended in the weeks before the seizure with abrupt changes. Authorities say that crew and owners changed the name to Marinera, painted a Russian tricolour on the superstructure, and registered the vessel under Russia's flag in an apparent bid to place it under Moscow's protection. The vessel's reflagging was part of a wider, deliberate pattern. Analysts found multiple sanctioned tankers moving suddenly from permissive private registries to the Russian registry as late 2025 opened. That change placed the tanker in a different legal envelope, one that Moscow argued meant the vessel could not lawfully be boarded, and it raised the stakes for any attempted interdiction. Windward, which uses maritime AI to detect such moves, published tracking data showing the Bella 1's IMO and the moment the ship signalled a new identity and new flag. What played out over the following days was a careful choreography of law, surveillance and applied force. US officials say the operation was carried out under US legal authority, citing court orders and sanctions enforcement actions tied to the vessel's alleged role in sanction evasion. The The US referred to its measures as part of a wider blockade to curtail illicit Venezuelan oil shipments. Public US statements framed the actions as enforcement of sanctions against vessels that had tried to export or otherwise move sanctioned Venezuelan crude. That legal framing mattered. A federal warrant, officials said, legitimized the boarding. On the diplomatic stage, Russia labeled the operation as piracy and demanded explanations, while the US argued that the vessel's behavior, including having been previously uncooperative with boarding attempts and changing registry mid-voyage, removed protections the ship might otherwise have claimed. Reuters, which first reported many of the operational details, noted that US and Allied aircraft had been tracking the ship, and that US Special Forces, followed by the Coast Guard, eventually secured it. Public, observable elements of the mission speak to how modern maritime interdiction is done. In the days before the boarding, patrol aircraft filled the Atlantic airspace above the vessel's route. Boeing P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol planes, described in official briefings and flight tracking analyses, and other ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms circled and relayed the ship's position, and, crucially, monitored nearby surface and undersea activity. Records and open-source flight tracking data showed US U-28 reconnaissance planes and refueling tankers in the theatre, and Allied RAF assets also operated in the area. Those aircraft broadened the operational picture. They made the location and movements of the ship and any potential escorts visible in near real time. P-8S are anti-submarine platforms by design, capable of dropping and monitoring sonobuoys and of coordinating with surface forces. Their presence signalled that commanders were prepared to treat possible undersea threats seriously. At the same time, a Coast Guard cutter shadowed and stalked the tanker until conditions allowed a boarding party to move. Business reporting and military officials' statements put the timeline at roughly a 2-week chase that ended with a coordinated move by seaborne and airborne forces. The tactic of saturation, bringing surveillance and potential response assets to bear until a target loses the ability to hide, was decisive. Western military aircraft gave a clear early warning. If a Russian submarine or surface escort came close, those assets would be watched and tracked. Reporting from several outlets indicates that Russian naval units, including a submarine, moved in the direction of the tanker during the pursuit, but that the US-led formation reached the vessel first and the potential for clash was avoided. The Russian government publicly complained that US forces used force against a vessel under the Russian flag and demanded the return of crew and an explanation of legal grounds. The United States countered with the position that the vessel's prior conduct, turning off its transponder, refusing to accept boarding near Venezuela, changing its identity, had left little room for peaceful compliance. The clash that did not happen mattered as much as the seizure itself. It showed how close a low-probability but high-impact incident can come to real confrontation in a crowded ocean environment. This operation sits on the same timeline as a far broader, rapidly changing energy and sanctions picture. Venezuela, despite years of collapse in production, still holds enormous oil resources. Proven reserves are commonly estimated at roughly 300 billion barrels, by far the largest national total in publicly cited datasets. Those reserves, concentrated in Venezuela's heavy crude fields, have been the target of international contestation for years. Sanctions, political decisions, and changing trading partners have shuffled who can take what oil, where. The value at stake is enormous. Even a fraction of Venezuela's stored crude represents billions of dollars in market value, and, for the US government, as it has laid out its policy, a source of finance for criminal and armed groups that Washington says profited from illicit oil flows. That economic weight explains why a single tanker, even if empty at the moment of seizure, can be treated as a strategic prize. The administration's declared blockade and enforcement posture aim to cut off that revenue flow and to deter the Shadow Fleet's operations worldwide. Beyond headlines, the mechanics of the boarding offer a close look at how forces now take control of a merchant ship. The classic image is a group lowering from a helicopter and sprinting across a deck, and in this case, the public footage and official statements show helicopter-borne teams were used to assert physical control. Commanders preferred helicopters for one practical reason: heavy seas and the tanker's size make fast boat approaches hazardous and slow. A precision helicopter insertion is fast. It denies the target time to destroy evidence or relocate key personnel, and it lets small numbers of well-trained operators secure bridge and engineering spaces quickly. In the footage released by US agencies, the sequence looks like this. Maritime patrol aircraft and surveillance platforms hold the picture and watch any potential naval moves. A cutter closes, and then helicopters place boarding teams on the deck. Teams move immediately to secure the bridge, stop engines, and take control of comms and navigation. Once the boarding party had secured the ship and verified the crew, US forces reported having placed the vessel under Coast Guard custody. The legal paperwork, the court warrant, and the public statements came later to make clear why the boarding had been lawful under the US framing. The name of the Coast Guard cutter, most often referenced in open accounts, is Munro, a Legend-class cutter that has in public filings and tracking images been in the North Atlantic during the period. Cutter Munro is one of a handful of US assets built for long patrols and interdiction missions. The Coast Guard's role is a key part of the US approach. It combines law enforcement and maritime security tools with military support when needed. That hybrid role is why the Department of Homeland Security and Pentagon participated jointly. After the initial securing by special forces, US officials said Coast Guard sailors escorted and then assumed custody of the vessel for legal disposition. The Navy and Allied air assets provided the surveillance and protection that let the Coast Guard operate without turning the event into a confrontation on the open sea. What the public record so far does not show in fine detail is the closed-door legality and diplomatic choreography that accompanies such a mission. A US federal court warrant was reported by officials as the legal vehicle applied to seize the tanker. That warrant is not the same thing as a universal license to seize any flagged vessel. Rather, it reflects a US legal path tied to sanctions, to criminal allegations, or to forfeiture claims. Russia protested in public statements and through its state news agencies, and the episode will inevitably see lawyers, diplomats and insurers argue over jurisdiction, over flag state responsibilities, and over the limits of enforcement in international waters. The deeper legal fight will matter for future cases. If ship owners learn that reflagging or quick name changes carry little protection, shipping behaviour could shift again. If flag states successfully push back, interdictions may become rarer. The law of the sea, the limits of jurisdiction, and the practicalities of enforcement are now an operational frontline. There are also political currents running under the operational facts. The boarding took place days after another high-profile operation. US Special Forces had captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a separate action, moves that already put Caracas and Moscow on edge, and changed calculations in capitals from Washington to Moscow. The United States framed the interdictions as part of a pressure campaign designed to ensure Venezuelan oil would not flow to buyers bypassing sanctions. High-level US officials posted footage on social media and made public comments stressing the blockade and the determination to intercept sanctioned cargoes around the globe. Russian officials called the US action illegal and warned of diplomatic consequences. The public messaging on both sides is part of the same contest that produced the episode at sea. Every boarding, every reflagging, every surveillance flight is now part of a broader geopolitical negotiation. The scene also illustrates how modern maritime enforcement layers capacities. Old hulls still move oil, but new sensors and data tools can find and follow them. Companies such as Windward and several shipping data providers have invested in algorithms that flag anomalous behavior, transponders switching off, AIS tracks that don't match expected routes, and rapid registry changes. Analysts publicly posted tracking maps showing how the Bella 1 journeyed from the Gulf of Oman, transited Suez and Gibraltar, skirted the Caribbean, and then veered north toward an ocean lane between Iceland and the UK. That odd routing drew attention. For years, the Shadow Fleet relied on low profile and minimal disclosure. Now, constant monitoring from multiple sources, military sensors, commercial AIS tracking, and maritime analytics, has turned the oceans into a more transparent stage. That transparency is why a ship that thought it could hide by repainting a hull found itself traced and ultimately boarded. If you want hard numbers, they are stark in different ways. Venezuela's proven reserves, commonly quoted at roughly 300 billion barrels, dwarf almost every other national reserve estimate and explain why control of its oil matters geopolitically. The Shadow Fleet's size is harder to pin down, but reputable maritime analysts place the number of vessels involved in sanctioned or opaque trades in the many hundreds by late 2025. Estimates differ by methodology, but the trend is unambiguous. More tankers are operating under uncertain flags and shifting identities than before. In December, registries such as Gambia and others moved to remove a number of vessels from their lists. In response, some of those ships switched to state-backed registries like Russia's in short order, a move Windward documented and highlighted as a deliberate shift towards state protection. Those data points explain why enforcement reached as far as the North Atlantic. The value at stake and the scale of the Shadow Fleet mean that ships can travel far and still matter. Another practical piece of the story is the weapons and sensors one reads about but rarely sees in action publicly. The P-8 Poseidon aircraft that patrolled above the tanker is not a mere photo plane. It is a maritime patrol aircraft with anti-submarine sensors and connectivity to naval assets. When P-8S are present, they are often supported by tankers for endurance, signals intelligence aircraft that can monitor communications, and by satellite feeds that overlay the same picture. Journalists and analysts passing flight tracks found KC-135 refueling sorties and U-28 reconnaissance planes active in the area in the hours and days before the boarding. That concentration of assets does more than prepare an operation. It reduces the chance for miscalculation by making the position and posture of every actor clear to the others. In other words, the surveillance was the safety rail that made a potentially dangerous boarding feasible without widening into a clash. There are human faces and names connected to this otherwise mechanical move. US public messaging came from multiple officials and departments. The Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security contributed statements. The US Defense Secretary posted a short, pointed message about enforcement of the blockade. The Secretary of Homeland Security shared imagery and statements about the operation. On the Russian side, a Transport Ministry statement said contact with the Marinera had been lost after US forces boarded, and members of the Duma labelled the move an act of piracy. Those public statements matter because they show how both sides wanted to shape the narrative. The United States emphasising law enforcement and sanctions, and Russia emphasising flag protection and legal sovereignty. One immediate consequence is that the seizure will be debated in international forums, insurance circles, and in legal filings. If you step back, the seizure illuminates a wider trend in which maritime commerce, illicit finance, and geopolitics converge. Two interlocking drivers are visible. First, economic pressure and sanctions have created incentives for actors to obfuscate the origin and destination of oil, a practice that can be profitable but also risky because it places vessels in legally fragile categories. Second, state-level responses, reflagging under a sponsor such as Russia, convert what was once a purely commercial evasion tactic into an instrument of geopolitical contest. That conversion explains why a tanker's repainting could trigger warship moves, and why a seizure in international waters matters as more than a headline. It is a test of whether the international order, built around registries, maritime law, and the freedom of the seas still functions when states themselves become actors in sanction evasion chains. Windward and other analysts have tracked the rapid reflagging trend and warned that state-backed protection of such fleets reduces the options for third parties unless they are prepared to escalate. The January boarding, therefore, is both an outcome and a signal. Enforcement is possible, but it comes with diplomatic cost. There will be costs and consequences that show more slowly than the dramatic footage of helicopters and sailors on deck. Legal claims over the vessel, insurance disputes about the boarding and compensation, and the question of what happens to the crew are all ongoing processes. International law specialists will pass whether a court-authorised seizure in international waters against a reflagged ship sets a precedent or fits within existing exceptions for stateless or fraudulently flagged vessels. Insurers and shipping companies will recalculate risk. Some will retreat from routes or tonnage that are no longer insurable at reasonable rates. Others will push for diplomatic channels to restore clear registries and paperwork. The shadow fleet itself may adapt, either by moving to less visible tankers or by seeking still more robust state backing. Each of those shifts will ripple into freight rates, refining patterns, and regional energy balances. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like so more people can see it. Share your thoughts in the comments because your opinion matters here. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories that go beyond headlines. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.